Welcome to our final video quick review for the AP Language and Composition exam for the 2019-2020 school year. So this year, as you guys know, the exam is entirely based on your score on the rhetorical analysis essay. In my classes and in my tutoring, this is something we spend significant time on because it's both the hardest of the three essays. It's also sort of the one that's at the core of the class, so to speak. This really is the center of the class, is learning rhetoric and then learning how to analyze other people's rhetorical choices. So what I want to do is sort of give a quick run through on the 6-point thesis. I generally recommend, for instructional purposes, for class purposes, using the old 9-point holistic rubric because it sets higher standards and really asks students to write a good paper all around. The new 6-point itemized rubric is nice because I think it works in the favor of students, but I don't know that it necessarily asks people to write the best papers they can. And in some cases, sort of sets students up to shut down on certain things that they can improve upon, which is why, again, I don't normally like to use this rubric for instructional purposes. But, you know, we only have a few days left until the exam, so now seems like the right time to help students see how to transition from the 9-point rubric to the 6-point rubric. For students enrolled in my class, I have attached a document to our most recent hyperdoc, and I think it's called like the basic outline for a functional but not necessarily great rhetorical analysis essay. I'm going to reference that a few times here, and if anyone happens to be watching this video who is not enrolled in my class, doesn't have access, you're welcome to send me an email and let me know, and I'd be happy to share that with you. I think that document's in reference to excerpts from Martin Luther King's speech at the Riverside Church when he sort of makes public and very strongly states his opposition to the Vietnam War. For this talk, I'm going to try to keep this quick and simple. And we're just going to run through the rubric itself and make some points about how we can go about sort of earning the points we need on this rubric. Now, a couple things, just thinking about the 2020 AP Lang exam. We don't know what cut scores are going to be. This is the first year that the College Board is using the new rubric. This is also the first time they've ever tried to do a full AP exam, a 5-point, result, just based on one essay. Now, 2 people will score the essays, so we do have some assurance that we'll be getting an accurate score based on, the rubric and the expectations. However, we don't know what the cut scores are going to be. A cut score is what you need to do to get a 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5, or 5 out of 5 for your final AP exam. This is a 6-point rubric. I mean, it stands to reason if you get a 6 out of 6, you'll probably get a 5 on the AP exam, right? You'll get the 5. It seems reasonable. If you get 5 out of the 6 points, does that mean that you get a 4 out of 5 on the AP exam? Does that mean you get a 3? That's the part we don't know. Okay, so what we're going to do is talk about what we probably need to do, and then I'll give you a couple quick tips for how to hopefully ensure that we get as many of these points as possible. First, let's talk about an introduction paragraph. An introduction paragraph for rhetorical analysis essay really needs to create some context and some background information so that we're not trying to analyze this text in a vacuum, in a bubble. We need the text to be operating like a living document inside of a real life situation. At some point, someone actually said this or wrote this, someone published this, and it was written at a specific time and generally for a specific reason. So what we really want to do in the introduction is try to contextualize a little bit before we go directly into the thesis. Now, on the past years and on the old rubric, you could essentially just go straight to your thesis. So in my classes and for my tutoring, we use what I call the PASTA breakdown: purpose, audience, subject, tones, and author's bias or author's background. Some classes prefer soapstone, which I always forget is speaker, occasion, audience, purpose, subject, tone. And then the new one this year is Space Cat, which throws in exigence and a bunch of other crap that may or may not actually need to be in a thesis, and whatever, it works. So everybody's got their acronym for it. My recommendation is looking at this new rubric that we do more than just that 1-sentence introduction, because that's what's going to help us to get all of the points available. So while the thesis point is the first row on this rubric, I actually want to jump down to the sophistication point, which for most people, this is the hardest one to earn. I've heard teachers refer to this as the unicorn. It's so rare, students almost think it doesn't exist. And I don't know if that's true. Now, again, we don't know exactly what the scoring is going to look like, but if we look carefully at what you need to do to get the one sophistication point, at least one of these things can be done in the introduction and then brought back in the conclusion, and it could help significantly. So while most of this talk is going to focus on the thesis and the body paragraphs, the evidence and commentary sections, let's take a quick look at sophistication. What do you need to do? Well, demonstrate sophistication of thought and or complex understanding of the rhetorical situation. So remember, your rhetorical situation, also called the rhetorical triangle, is the relationship between speaker, audience, and purpose. Some people, some textbooks won't say purpose, they'll say the subject. That's fine. In the end, all rhetoric is about achieving a desired outcome. So rather than stop at subject, I always say, let's just go straight to purpose. So for my teaching, I say we need to think about your speaker or author, your intended audience, and maybe a secondary audience if that's applicable, and then the purpose. What is it you're trying to do? And so everything that we're looking at in this essay is really about analyzing not the corners of the triangle, but about analyzing the sides, the connecting pieces. How does the author choose what to say? Based on his or her background, their beliefs, their experiences, you can't choose something you don't know. Your life presents you with the knowledge that you have, and that then creates your options. So if this is an essay about talking, if this essay is talking about the author's choices, we need to know, what did they choose from? So we start with the author. This person said this. And I'm going to say a sentence, about how or why they chose it, given their own interests and background. Then I'm going to try to very quickly connect to the audience. Well, how did the author make that choice for that audience? Why does the author think that was the right way to say it, the best way to say it, to get that audience to feel, think, or do whatever that purpose is going to be? So the author makes a choice based on the combination of his or her background and his or her perception of the audience and the audience's desires, needs, or expectations. Then I'm going to talk about how the audience responds. What's the reaction? What's the effect of that author's choice? And then how does that effect lead to purpose? If we want to say, the author uses some very angry and frustrating diction, great. And it's kind of plain, but that's fine. You don't just say the author uses angry words so the audience feels angry, so he accomplished the purpose. How does that happen? How did the author choose the words? How do those words specifically affect that audience, given the social situation, the context, their previous feelings, expectations, whatever? How do those words hit the audience at that moment? And then how does that make them feel? And then why is that resulting feeling, why is that effect something that ultimately leads to the purpose? That's what we're trying to do here. So when, for sophistication, it says that you need sophistication of thought, that means we need to dig deep, we need to read well, we need to make interesting, sophisticated connections between the different things we see happening in the text. We also need to be able to connect to some background knowledge that hopefully we're bringing to the table. This isn't a test of what you know or don't know, but on average, students who are doing a little better in their history classes, students who pay attention to current events, on average, tend to do a little bit better on this essay or, on this test, just because you have some knowledge and you can put these things into context. So that's the first part. Second part then says, and or a complex understanding of the rhetorical situation. Well, that means you don't just state the most obvious thing about the speaker, the audience, and the purpose. It means that we understand there's some nuance, there's some shades of gray. We understand that no one is purely good or bad. We understand that no audience is as simple as just saying, well, they're all American, or they're all of a particular religion, political party, race, etc. Even within those groups, there's some disagreement. And so that complex understanding means that you address the nuance. You see the complexity and the sophistication comes out, right? And so how do we do this? Well, let's look at the actual 1 through 6 points here. So first it says, responses that earn this point may demonstrate sophistication of thought and or a complex understanding of the rhetorical situation by doing any of the following. Now, if we're to trust the language in the rubric, that would mean that you only really have to do one. You can do any of them. If you do any one of them well, in theory, you would get this point. For me, I'm looking at this list and I'm thinking it's probably pretty easy for most people to do at least one of them. So I would argue that you want to, within reason, try to do most of them. Now, if you are a struggling student, when I say struggle, you don't have to be doing terribly. Just if you're looking at the old rubric and you are scoring 2s, 3s, don't worry about this so much. I mean, if you can do it, but don't put pressure on yourself to get the sophistication point. The easiest points to get are elsewhere. Okay. If you're a student that's scoring, strong fours, fives, low sixes, then sophistication point is a thing that we can think about. But again, you don't have to put pressure on yourself to do this. In general, with a week or so, a little under a week to go until your exam, I would tell you that you're either already earning the sophistication point or you're not. There's not a lot you're probably going to do in the last few days of reviewing, reflecting on your work, writing a practice essay or something like that. There's not a lot you're going to do to build in the sophistication now. That's probably already done. I don't mean to discourage anyone. I'm just saying let's be realistic and not put extra pressure on ourselves. Let's look at the list and see if there are things that we can do without too much trouble that put us in a position to get this point. Number one, crafting a thesis that demands nuanced consideration of textual evidence to prove and then successfully proves it. If you make it clear that it's not as simple as this person addresses this audience to accomplish this purpose, and you throw in a couple of rhetorical strategies or choices or tone words, you need to do a little bit better than that. If you acknowledge that what the author is doing is complicated and maybe is not perfect, or that there's some contradictions or some subtlety in it, maybe there's even places where you can acknowledge how the audience will respond in more than one way, but how regardless of the response, the purpose still ends up being mostly achieved. That's great. That's a hard thesis to write well. And it's very difficult to prove, to analyze those points clearly as you go through your body paragraphs. But that really would be a sophisticated paper, which is why they put that at number one. That's probably the most important thing to be trying to do here if you're a student who believes you can earn the sophistication point within your time limit. Again, I should probably have said that earlier. If I gave you 2 weeks to write this essay and to go through a few drafts and have a friend read it over, almost everyone could get the sophistication point. The question is, can you do that in 40 to 45 minutes? That's tough because on a first draft, it's not always easy to generate this complexity of thought. Okay, so that's what we have to remember. We're working under time constraints. Okay. Number two, explaining the significance or relevance of the text's purpose within a broader context. This, in my opinion, is probably the easiest thing to do to get at least some of the sophistication point criteria, right? In your introduction, as I started there, I said, you want a sentence or two where you maybe identify some historical context, some kind of exigence, just what's going on culturally that sets up the rhetorical situation. We have to remember that this speaker, this audience, and this purpose don't exist in a vacuum either. There's this whole world that's going on that contains this moment in time, this text. What we want to try to do in an opening sentence or two is to clarify what is that context, what is that situation. Then we go into our thesis. You do your body paragraphs, blah, blah, blah. We'll talk about that in a second. When you go to a conclusion, generally speaking, a conclusion in rhetorical analysis is like the place that you score the fewest points. You can essentially end without a concluding paragraph, and you probably can still pull a decent score, but you're certainly not going to get the sophistication point because we need to round this thing out. So what I recommend when you get to a concluding paragraph is that in your first sentence or two, you sort of restate and sum up your thesis. Don't copy and paste word for word. Just remind people of that pasta breakdown, soapstone, or space cat. At a minimum, do the triangle, speaker, audience, purpose, and indicate how the author's choices have led to achievement of purpose. Now, this is not easily done, but if you do have some background knowledge, or you know something about the speaker, you know something about the audience, the historical period, whatever it may be, then what we want to do is on a concluding paragraph, you start with your thesis and you sort of broaden out. You're going to work out into broader ideas where maybe you can connect, say, if you're analyzing a text by John F. Kennedy, and you happen to also know a couple other speeches by JFK, what you can then do is connect a couple of the points that you've made in this paper to how they represent some of the broader stylings of JFK speeches. You may point out that the things that you've said here apply to many of his speeches, and therefore then also apply to many of the other politicians and leaders who were inspired by JFK. Now we're doing the broader context of number two here. We're saying, look, what I've said about this text applies to this whole author and then to people that know the author. You can also point out how maybe this text is somehow indicative of the time period or that cultural movement. If you're dealing with, say, something about immigrant rights or workers' rights, something about the Cesar Chavez essay from a few years ago, maybe if you know a little bit about the workers' rights movement or about immigration policy and reform since the 60s, 1970s on, then what you try to do is talk about what the author says and then broaden out to how this text somehow represents the bigger ideas within that movement, within that cultural experience. If you can make a connection between this text, little point, and the big situation that surrounds it, that helps us to do the broader context. We want to make connections. If you're dealing with a text that has a lot of American sort of ideals, patriotic tones, maybe connect it back to American ethos and the ideals from our Constitution and Declaration of Independence. That would be number 2. Okay. Number 3, engaging in concession, rebuttal, and or refutation of other arguments relating to the thesis. This is essentially saying that if you use counter arguments well, counter arguments are not necessarily a requirement in rhetorical analysis because you're not making a traditional argument or persuasive essay. What we're doing is analyzing the text. However, if you point out that some people may respond to the text differently than you have, or you can point out how some people in the audience will respond negatively, but you think the author wanted the positive thing, you can make a counter argument. Of course, some in the audience would have felt this way, would have felt attacked, offended, would have felt that was un-American, blah, 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 whatever. However, and you got to bring it back, point out why they didn't actually feel that way or why that's wrong, or point out how even if some people did feel that way, that does not automatically eliminate them from the crowd. It does not mean that they can't also end up thinking or doing what the author wants them to do. If you can concede that some people may see it differently or that some audience members maybe responded differently, then bring back to why your analytical points are still valid, why your statements about how the author's choices affect the audience and how the audience is ultimately led to the purpose. If you can point out that that's still valid despite disagreement or whatever else, that's great. And that could potentially get you in for number 3 here. That also brings in some of that sort of nuanced consideration from number 1. Number 4, recognizing and accounting for contradictions or complexities within the text. If you see the author contradict himself or herself, or maybe bring up some issues that seem very important, but then later on they downplay it, something like that, it's perfectly fine for you to point out places where the author is not perfectly consistent or where the author seems to say things that maybe partially undermine his or her own purpose. You do not want to assume that these texts are riddled with errors. You also do not want to assume that the author has in any way been lazy, sloppy, or stupid. College Board works very hard to provide you with quality texts, and so we should assume that we've been given something of quality. Okay, so, but if you do see contradiction, some complexity, you see a little bit of a flip-flop or an interesting shift, sometimes even something as simple as tone shifts, that can work for number 4. Number 5, making effective rhetorical choices that strengthen the force and impact of the student's argument. It means you have to write it well. You're the writer, and so while you're analyzing someone else's writing, they would still like for you to be a good writer. You need to write this thing well. And you're also, even though it's not specifically persuasive writing, as I tell all of my students, all communication is persuasive. You're trying to convince the reader to understand the source text as you do. You want them to see the author making the choices that you've identified. You want them to think about the audience's reactions in the way that you've indicated. So in the end, you are still kind of doing some persuasion because you need to convince the reader that this is really what's going on in this text and how this thing really works. In order to do that, you need to write good, clean, clear, crisp, correct sentences. It means we need to vary our sentence length and sentence structures. We shouldn't be writing in all simple or all compound sentences. Vary it up, use all 4 patterns. Good use of diction. It means that you might employ some things like juxtaposition. You might add a little imagery in your context at the beginning or the end. You might use some anaphora, some repetition, some interesting listing to make your writing a little more engaging or a little more persuasive. You need to write with a little bit of flair, a little bit of your own style, and that's going to be important. That's actually a very important part of getting the sophistication point. And again, if you're thinking back to the old 9-point rubric, this is where, to get the sophistication point, most teachers are interpreting this, at least for now, till we get more guidance and more practice. Most teachers are looking at this as the papers that used to be 8s and 9s, maybe a really strong 7, would get the sophistication point. If you look at this list, there's no reason that an essay that we used to score a 5 out of 9, there's no reason that essay couldn't get a sophistication point here if it's doing all of these things, but maybe you're uneven in your body paragraphs. So I don't want anyone to say the sophistication point isn't for me, it's not worth trying. But most of these points do indicate you have to be a pretty strong writer, pretty good critical, close reader. You need to have some skills here, but if you're already writing high 4s, 5s, and 6s, if you're a good writer, you might still be able to pull the sophistication point, even if you're not 100% on the evidence and commentary section, which we'll get back to in a moment. Okay, so write it well. You need to have your own style and voice in this thing. Last one, number 6, utilizing a prose style that is especially vivid, persuasive, convincing, or appropriate to the student's argument. See number 5. You need to write it well. Be a good writer. Just because you're writing analysis doesn't mean it needs to be boring. I think most people hear analysis essay and no, like you need to write with a little bit of passion. You got to have a little bit of fire. You need to have your own tone. Now, don't get too far off course. Don't make this about you. Just write the analysis well and make it interesting. Okay, so we can get that sophistication point probably most easily, if we're to trust the language of the rubric, by having a little bit of contextual introduction before the thesis and a little bit of broader context in the concluding paragraph. Of course, we want some nuance and we want some complexity, we want some shades of gray throughout the entire essay. We want to pay attention to details, make good connections, and write it well. But for a student who's on the edge here, just some good context to start and end might be enough to get you that point, or at least get you close, and then hope you've done the other things along the way. Okay, now let's scroll back up and take a look at the thesis. The thesis is the most important sentence in any essay, and in this case, that is true again. Your thesis, just like sophistication point, is a 1 or a 0. You get it or you don't get it. So what's the thesis have to be? Well, your thesis has to respond to the prompt, it has to be defensible, it has to analyze the writer's rhetorical choices. Notice it says responses that earn this point. The thesis responds to the prompt rather than restating or rephrasing the prompt, and clearly articulates a defensible thesis about the rhetorical choices the writer makes. You cannot state facts. Do not write a summary. Don't summarize the text in a sentence. That's not good. Don't rewrite the prompt. That's not good. Do not state facts. If you say this person gave a speech about this topic to this audience, that's a fact. That happened. They probably told you that in the intro, in the prompt. They probably told you that in the language of the prompt. So we always want to look at the prompt carefully because they'll give us some information. We also need to look at the prompt carefully to make sure that we're not restating it, or we're not being plain and just sort of using just the basic pieces. Here's a basic format for a rhetorical analysis thesis that can work. I'm not saying this is the best thing ever. And if you're a good writer, if you're doing these well, you're probably doing better than this already. If you're writing these inconsistently, or if you need a little boost, maybe a format like this can help. Again, if you're looking at the other document, you see a format provided for you. Something in general that I recommend is an easy way to put a thesis like this together to get all the pasta, soapstone, space cat components in to one sentence without that sentence dragging on forever, getting too complicated, is do it like this. In a discussion of subject, what's it about, comma, who's the person, the leader blank, civil rights leader, the speaker of the, who's the person. Okay, so give that author's background and then the author's name. After the author's name, I want you to think of tone words, but I want you to write them as adverbs. So instead of saying the author employs a frustrated tone, say, well, frustratedly isn't really a word, but angrily, disappointed, in a disappointing manner, things like that. If it's angry, say the author angrily, fervently. Use those stronger words, but put them into the form of an adverb. Why? Because we're going to go in a discussion of subject, comma, this person, author, adverb, tone as an adverb, and then get a strong action verb. Motivates, persuades, requests, pleads, implores, demands, suggests, whatever that may be. To this audience, be specific. Who's the audience? Don't just say the people. Don't say the people in the building. Say, the readers of the magazine. Think who would be in the building, who would be in the magazine. Make a few guesses about the demographics. Do we know their beliefs, their values, their nationality, their race, their religion, their sex, their gender, their socioeconomic status. I mean, who do we think would be in the room, or who do we think would read this article or pay for that newspaper magazine, right? So we'll go the author, tone word as an adverb, strong action verb, to the audience. And then you just say to, put your purpose in. So for the Martin Luther King speech, I don't have my notes, but I think it's something like in discussion of poverty, civil rights in the Vietnam War, civil rights leader and minister Martin Luther King angrily and graphically implores his audience of Christian Americans in the Riverside Church in New York City to oppose the Vietnam War. Cool. Now, I can write a closed thesis where I'll list out the topics or the choices that I'm going to analyze in the body paragraphs. I just slap it on the end. So I'd say, to oppose the Vietnam War through his use of, and list them out if you want. If you're a student that has a tendency to ramble a little bit, or if you get off topic easily, go ahead and do the closed thesis. By making sure that I've used a clear tone word with my verb, and then that I've been very specific about the purpose, I have something that's defensible. People can disagree about the exact purpose. People can also disagree about the tone. Now, I might be able to be a little more clear and talk with a little more nuance about how the author addresses this particular concept, and then cautiously avoids this other one, so as to, make all audience members ultimately agree with blah, blah, blah. That's some of the extra complexity and nuance, is where I can point out how the author says something but doesn't say something else, how the author harkens back to some previous stylings to give a certain feeling. The more detailed I can be here without saying anything that's confusing or making the sentence too long is good. It makes sure, one, that it's an arguable and therefore defensible thesis, and two, it might get me closer to the sophistication point, okay? But you can keep it simple. I mean, my basic outline, that basic format, isn't beautiful, but it works. So if you're struggling with that, this is a place that, use that and you get the point, okay? Now to the body paragraphs. This is the evidence and commentary section. I'm going to read the to column because two is kind of our breaking point. We always want to be scoring above the two. Really, we want to just score 4 out of 4 every time, obviously. And I don't actually think that that's out of reach. It's one of the things I don't like about this rubric, is that the top category, in each of these doesn't actually look like it's insanely difficult to get. And for an AP exam, I would love to see a little bit more of a demand on the reader, or on the writer, on the student. So we're going to look at the two and then assume that everything we can and will do is going to be better than that. Okay. If you're interested in the 0 and the 1, the language is there in the rubric for you. So in the to column, for 2 out of 4 points for the evidence and commentary, you would say, 2, makes textual references, direct quotes or paraphrases that are relevant to the thesis. That is a common point between 2, 3, and 4 point, scoring here. You have to have direct quotes or specific paraphrases that are relevant to the thesis. Now, not every piece of evidence has to go all the way back to your main pasta thesis. The topic sentence in each body paragraph should be a claim. It should be like a sub-thesis. So instead of having to say the author makes these choices to achieve this purpose, right? In your topic sentence, you can just say, throughout the text, trying to think of an example. Throughout the text, Hazlitt, that's a great text, Hazlitt employs a variety of punctuation and verbal phrases to craft long, complicated, and overwhelming sentences to help the audience understand the problems of poverty. All I'm saying is the author makes this choice for this effect. The rest of the paragraph is going to be about that specific choice. I'm not going to talk about the point that the author's trying to prove about poverty, or the author's trying to prove about opposing Vietnam. I'm going to talk about how, just in this paragraph, I'm going to talk about how the author employs this strategy. So in that essay, I could talk about all the commas and semicolons, the verbal phrases, all the additional prepositional phrases. Like, there's a lot of things going on that create a very long and overwhelming sentence. So I'm just going to write a paragraph about just that, okay? I must have evidence that supports that claim. It has to support the topic sentence. And whatever it is you're trying to prove with that topic sentence, that should be in line with the general thesis. Okay, sometimes students get overwhelmed and think, well, how do I pull a piece of evidence, about sentence complexity and still support the thesis? Well, remember that a good topic sentence is making a claim. It's sort of a sub-thesis. The author makes this choice to accomplish this purpose or to get this effect. Pick a piece of evidence that very specifically and clearly demonstrates the choice that you've just identified in the topic sentence, okay? That is going to be standard whether you're going to get a 2 or a 3 or a 4 out of 4 in this section. So I'm not going to explain that again later. You've got to make sure that your evidence is specific and clear to that topic, okay? Now, the rest of that language for the 2 provides commentary. However, it repeats, oversimplifies, or misinterprets the cited information or evidence. This is where you actually somehow just summarize. Like sometimes people put in a quote and then the next sentence or two, they summarize, paraphrase, or explain what the quote means. Assume the reader is also, assume that your grader, the AP reader, is also a good reader. Assume that they understand the point that you're talking about here. You don't need to repeat it. You don't need to paraphrase it. You don't need to summarize it unless somehow you're talking about content. And that's usually something we need to be very careful about. If you oversimplify it, if you pull something that is actually a very complicated piece of evidence, and then you talk about it is just simple black and white, you make it seem very obvious and dull, and maybe you only say one thing about it, that would be oversimplifying. The last is misinterprets. If you misinterpret what you've chosen, you don't understand the evidence that you pulled, that's a problem. Or maybe you've misunderstood the broader text. So even though maybe you pulled evidence that fit the claim, but maybe what you're claiming isn't exactly right, now we're at a 2 or lower. Okay, now we have to work from the 2 and we start working our way back down, and we have to talk about those other points. So you want to be very, very careful that we're picking evidence that is appropriate. We also need to make sure that we fully understand the text, which means we have to have read it reasonably carefully. Okay, number 3, or to get the 3. And by the way, you have the rest of the language there for the descriptions. Our focus is really on getting at least a 3 and preferably the 4. So that's where we're going to go next. So to get a 3, you have to have the evidence like we talked about. Then provides commentary that explains the relationship between evidence and the thesis. However, commentary is uneven, limited, or incomplete. That used to be a description that lined up with a 5 out of 9 on the old rubric. And that's not necessarily a great paper. Now, if you look at the average scores for the rhetorical analysis essay for the last 20 years, a 5 is actually still above average. The average essay, I think, usually scores between like a 4 point, I think it's like a 4.2 and a 4.5 or something like that on the 9-point scale. So, maybe getting a 3 wouldn't really be so bad, except if you look at those words, those are still negative words. This is still not a good essay. It's an essay that's doing the right things, but it hasn't done them particularly well. I don't think that's a goal that we should set for ourselves, even though a 3 might set us up for an acceptable score for the AP exam as a whole. So commentary is uneven. That might mean that I have a lot to say in one body paragraph and very little in another, or I elaborate on one point and then skip over something else. If I pull evidence, I need to be able to talk about all of it evenly, thoroughly, and consistently. Limited, that means I didn't say enough. As a basic rule, when you introduce a piece of evidence, you want to have at least three analytical comments, 3 analytical sentences to go with it. If you pick a piece of evidence and you can only say one thing about it, you picked the wrong evidence. You can't dig deep enough. This is an essay where you score points on depth, not as much for breadth. It's better to have 2 body paragraphs that are long and well developed. You can say a lot about what you've chosen rather than to have 3 or 4 or 5 body paragraphs where you can only say 1 or 2 things. Doesn't mean that that's not analysis. It just means you're not really looking at the complexity of the text. You're not developing a deeper idea about it. So that's something we need to be very, very careful about. Okay. So that's limited. The last one be incomplete. This is, we could literally run out of time and not finish, our final body paragraph, and that would be a problem. We need to manage our time well. Incomplete might also be where you sort of get halfway to connecting to purpose and then stop and go to the next paragraph. Now, I do have a little trick here. This is not great writing, but this is, again, where we can take a student who's on the verge. You're kind of struggling, you're kind of getting it, but it's not fully happening in every essay. I have a little formula that can maybe help to bump a 2 to a 3 or ideally a 3 to a 4. Now, if you're a strong writer, if you're already doing well in these, you don't need to do this. Okay, this is not a great essay, right? But this might be something that can score reasonably well given this rubric. Topic sentence that functions as a claim. The author makes this particular choice, employs this particular strategy for this effect, for this purpose. And then introduce evidence. Give the quote. Keep your quotes short. Okay, if it's a 3-line sentence, but you only really need a 5-word phrase in the middle, just copy the 5-word phrase. You don't need the rest of it. Just work the 5-word phrase into your own writing. Keep the evidence focused and short when possible. After I introduce the evidence, I want to have at least 3 and preferably 4 or 5 analytical comments. Now watch how we can do this. Let's say the author makes reference to some large numbers, trying to overwhelm people, right? And this is a person who maybe in their past has been very poor, but is now more successful. I'm just making something up. I introduce the topic, the idea about using large and exaggerated numbers to overwhelm or excite the audience. I then give the evidence. First, analytical comment, I talk about how or why the author thought this was an appealing choice. Given the author's background as a person growing up in poverty who now enjoys great material wealth, the idea of having large numbers, of having prosperous descriptions is appealing to that author. I then talk about why the author thinks that that's a good decision for the audience. That author, understanding the audience's desire for greater wealth and success in their own lives, employs these larger numbers to inspire excitement and hope for the future for people who see that prosperity is possible. Great. So now, one about why the author thought it might be a good choice, another sentence about why the author chose it specifically for that intended audience. The next sentence, talk about the effect on the audience. The audience hearing this connects that idea with these other things in their lives or with the other thing the author said right before it. And as a result, they feel very excited and optimistic that progress can be made, that something can happen. Why did the author think that was a good choice for himself or herself? Why does the author choose it for that intended audience? How does the audience respond? And then connect it back to purpose. How does the audience's response connect to the purpose? Once the audience feels this particular way, they're more likely to agree, to go do, to speak out, to whatever the author wants them to do. If I can get the audience, if the speaker can get the audience to think or feel whatever it is he wants them to feel at that moment, it increases the chance of accomplishing the purpose. See how I'm doing that, going around that triangle? That's the goal. That's an easy way to work in 3 to 5 sentences without ever having to really dig deep or do anything that complex. Now, that's probably not getting you a sophistication point. That's not a great essay, but it's a functional essay. And if I can do that reasonably evenly, I've probably done a little bit better than the descriptions of the 3. Let's read the scoring notes and decision rules at the bottom for the 3. Typical responses that earn 3 points provide commentary that is developed and insightful in places, but there are occasional lapses into description or minor inaccuracies. You could follow my format and still do that. That'd be okay. I mean, well, it's not ideal, but that might be where we're at. Provide commentary that is clear, but there are times when the link between the textual evidence and the thesis may be strained. This is where your evidence isn't perfectly selected, or maybe you're reading into it a little bit more than's there. You're not inaccurate. You're just seeing some things that aren't entirely perfect, right? Now, okay, it's still functional, but we haven't capitalized on all our opportunities. My format will still help with that. It'll get you at least to that 3. Now, another way to make sure, if you're a student that sometimes rambles off of subject, or sometimes we lose sense of purpose, if I'm your teacher and you've heard me say, so what, or how, or why, how and why are all the other things in there. How they choose it, how's that for the audience, why does the audience respond, why is the response lead to purpose? So what is a comment you get sometimes at the end of a body paragraph, because it means you didn't connect it back to the thesis. So at the end of each body paragraph, have a concluding sentence. Before you transition into your next paragraph, your next choice or whatever it is you got to do next, make sure that you have a sentence that clearly indicates, to ensure the most optimistic and energetic response from fill in the blank, what kind of audience, the speaker, put in their name and maybe an adjective about them, employs the use of those large numbers, because that will blah, blah, blah. It's a little bit of summary. It's a little bit of repetition. You got to be careful you don't flat repeat yourself. But it's a nice way to make sure that the paragraph ends with a clear support of the topic sentence, the claim you made. And if you wrote that well, that was already supporting your thesis. Sometimes that concluding sentence doesn't feel great. It doesn't sound great, but it can make sure that we're fully going the whole way around that rhetorical triangle. We didn't stop short somewhere. Okay. Now, that also might prevent us from getting a sophistication point if we're a little too obvious and plain about it. So do be careful. But if you're a student who has a tendency to, if your teacher says you're stopping short or go further or connect it to your thesis, concluding sentence where you just, how the author's choice was chosen specifically for that audience, and that supports the purpose of the whole essay. Okay. Now, in the 4, obviously we have the evidence again, but then it says provides well-developed commentary that consistently and explicitly explains the relationship between the evidence and the thesis. You're actually doing the whole triangle well. You're making connections between all the details and the evidence you've selected and how all those details work together to affect the audience in a particular way and how that effect leads them to do or think or agree, with the purpose. Look to the scoring notes. So typical responses that earn 4 points provide commentary that engages specific details from the sources to draw conclusions. You got to be precise. You got to be specific. You got to make it very clear why you're drawing the conclusions you're drawing. Okay. And then integrate evidence from sources throughout to support the student's reasoning. So this is where my format puts you on the line between the 3 or the 4. Really what they're saying there is not to have just like one chunk of evidence and then all of your own commentary. It's to start with the claim, to put in a little bit of evidence, and then as you're doing the commentary, to weave in some additional pieces of evidence as you go. So instead of just loading the whole sentence in early and then writing 4 or 5 sentences of commentary, they're saying that maybe it's better that you put in the concept or the first piece of the evidence, start talking about it, and then you introduce additional words or phrases as you go. And sort of scatter your evidence into it. This is where you have to have read the text a little more carefully so you fully understand all the author's decisions. You also have to be a pretty good writer because it means you have to have a clear plan in mind where I know that I'm going to connect the dots, so to speak, and I know what dots to include in my essay so that I can then connect them through that commentary. This requires, a little more sophistication and in some cases a little more planning. You can do the format that I just gave you and still do this, but that would just essentially mean you essentially front load the bigger quote or the big paraphrase. And then throughout the commentary, you introduce those like individual words and phrases as you go to help you clarify your explanation. Okay. One additional note at the bottom of this section. Writing that suffers from grammatical and or mechanical errors that interfere with communication cannot earn the 4th point in this row. If you're writing a sloppy paper, a lot of grammar mistakes, a lot of spelling mistakes, bad word choice, you're using words in ways like you don't know what the words mean, you're just throwing them in there, you're not going to get the 4. So they do throw that in there because if you write an ugly paper, even if the analysis is good, but in the end your writing itself was kind of gross, you're getting the 3 here. Now, let's think about our scoring. If we can get the thesis point, we want everyone to get the thesis point, right? So we get our thesis point, and then we get 3 out of 4 for the evidence and commentary. So that gets us to 4. That's 4 out of 6 points. That gives you a fighting chance for a 3 out of 5 on the exam, right? I mean, we don't know what the cut score is going to be, but if you get that and then you throw in the sophistication point because you have some context and a couple counter arguments, you're 5 out of 6. You can almost guarantee, I can't guarantee, I can almost guarantee that a 5 out of 6 is going to earn a passing score, a 3 out of 5 or more. If you can get the thesis, right, and then you can get all 4 of the body paragraph points, the evidence and commentary, you're at a 5 out of 6. Even if it's not terribly sophisticated, you don't have the context and the other stuff, 5 out of 6, you're in good shape. Generally speaking, a person who can write the 4 out of 4, without too much struggle in the middle, has a pretty good shot at getting that sophistication point. I think we're going to see a lot of students who are capable of writing the 5 out of 6 or even 6 out of 6 essay. Again, assuming that we have the right approach, that we read the text carefully, that we make sure we write a clear, focused, arguable, and defensible thesis. I think that a lot of students have a very good chance of doing very well in this scoring format, despite the fact that we don't have the other 2 essays in the multiple choice. I do think it's important for students to review their own work. I think when possible, it's good to look at samples. We can't share the AP scored samples online, but if you have any of your old work, or maybe you can even share with a peer, swap essays with a friend, and just get a sense of what do other people's essays look like. A good Google search, and you'll find a lot of sample rhetorical analysis essays online from college classes, high school classes, things like that. I do think it's a good idea to go ahead and check and to see some samples, and then to look back at this rubric and see what you can do with it, okay? Focus on the rhetorical triangle. Focus on how and why the author writes, not just what. How did the author write it? How did he or she choose it? How does that affect the audience? Why does that effect on the audience ultimately lead to purpose? Make sure that everything connects back to your claims and your thesis, then try to write it well, okay? If you can get through that and give yourself even a minute and a half, 2 minutes to skim over and do a quick proofread, I'd say you've done an excellent job. And then we cross our fingers and hope that the submissions and all that stuff work. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Ha ha ha, a real thriller, but hopefully you found some of this useful. If you do have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to email me. My students can use my school email address. Any other viewers are welcome to contact me at mrtibbens@yahoo.com, mrtibbens@yahoo.com. You can also check out my tutoring page on Facebook. It's facebook.com/TibbensEST. I'm also on Twitter. I believe it's the same tag, TibbensEST. Thank you very much, and good luck on your test.